844 souls vanished in minutes, not amidst a violent mid-ocean storm, but while tethered securely to a city dock. The SS Eastland didn't strike jagged rocks, nor was she overwhelmed by mountainous waves. In broad daylight, under the gaze of thousands, this modern vessel suddenly transformed from a passenger liner into an iron cage of death. How does a massive, stationary steel structure suddenly betray its own geometry and surrender to the water? As we pull back the curtain on this impossible disaster, a chilling pattern emerges. 100 years later, an invisible, lethal thread still binds this tragedy to modern catastrophes like the MV Sewol. It's not just bad luck lurking beneath the surface, it's a recurring, human-made ghost waiting for the perfect storm to strike. What silent, fatal choices are being repeated today, hidden in the blueprints of progress? Join me as we venture into the graveyard of the Great Lakes to unmask these secrets. I invite you to stay with me until the very end. We aren't just piecing together a wreckage. We are confronting a haunting question. Are we finally learning from the ghosts of our past? Or are we simply marking time until the next inevitable disaster claims its due? The morning of the 24th of July 1915 in Chicago dawned with a deceptively tranquil beauty. For the employees of the Western Electric Company, it was meant to be the highlight of their year, a grand excursion to Michigan City, Indiana, a day promised to be filled with music, laughter, and the cooling breezes of Lake Michigan. By 7 a.m., the South Water Street dock on the Chicago River was a hive of vibrant activity. Families, many of whom were hard-working immigrants who had built their lives in the industrial heartbeat of America, boarded the SS Eastland with joyful anticipation. There were 2,500 tickets issued, and the ship was straining under the weight of an immense crowd, all eager to leave the sweltering heat of the city behind. The SS Eastland was built in 1903 by the Jenks Shipbuilding Company in Port Huron, and was designed to be the speed queen of the Great Lakes. Her designers prioritized a sleek, narrow hull and aggressively powerful engines, sacrificing the fundamental stability required for a vessel of her class. From her earliest days, the Eastland was notoriously tender. In nautical parlance, a tender ship possesses a perilously high center of gravity, causing it to roll excessively, even in moderate currents or light winds. Despite these glaring warning signs during her initial sea trials, the ship was allowed to operate. Over the ensuing decade, she underwent a series of ownership changes and structural modifications that would have terrified any diligent naval engineer. Each improvement was a calculated gamble. More cabins were added, more glass was installed, and heavy, topside furniture was bolted down. Every addition pushed the center of gravity higher, further reducing the ship's margin of stability. By 1915, the Eastland was effectively a top-heavy skyscraper perched on a dangerously narrow foundation, a vessel that existed in a perpetual state of precarious equilibrium. Following the RMS Titanic disaster, the United States government enacted stringent new maritime safety regulations, requiring every passenger vessel to carry enough lifeboats for everyone on board, and the owners of the Eastland were trapped by their own past negligence. Forced to comply with the law, they installed massive, heavy, iron davit-mounted lifeboats on the uppermost promenade deck. These lifeboats, along with their associated rafts and heavy equipment, added approximately 70 tons of weight to the very pinnacle of the ship. In the archives of the Chicago Historical Society today, one can still find the letters and notes written by these families just days before the ill-fated excursion. They were filled with the mundane, beautiful details of life. Young women planning the colors of their summer dresses, fathers promising their children the excitement of the lake, and immigrants expressing gratitude for the stability and promise of their new lives. On that humid July morning, the atmosphere on the dock was electric with community spirit. As the clock approached 7 a.m., the upper decks began to crowd rapidly. Passengers, unaware of the death trap beneath their feet, rushed to the port side to wave at friends and family still standing on the dock. This spontaneous mass migration of people toward one side of the ship provided the final, fatal torque to a vessel already teetering on the edge of collapse. The physical weight of the crowd, combined with the extreme instability caused by the top-heavy lifeboat modifications, was too much for the Eastland to bear. At 7:10 a.m., disaster struck with a haunting, chilling silence. There was no collision, no explosion, and no sound of crashing waves. The Eastland began to list, not with a sudden jerk, but with a slow, agonizing, and inexorable slide. Captain Harry Pedersen, watching in horror from the bridge, realized the immediate danger and ordered the ballast tanks to be filled in a desperate attempt to stabilize the ship. And it was a mistake that would haunt the rest of his life. By introducing water into tanks that were already struggling to compensate for the list, he further compromised an already unstable hull, causing it to lose whatever grip it had on the water. The list increased from 10 degrees to 20, then 30. Then the panic began. The heavy lifeboats, now swinging dangerously toward the water as the deck tilted, accelerated the roll like a runaway freight train. In mere moments, the Speed Queen capsized completely, coming to rest on the shallow, muddy bottom of the Chicago River, trapping hundreds of passengers in the lower decks where the water rushed in with terrifying, unstoppable force. The response to the disaster was as chaotic and fractured as the event itself. Because the ship remained partially above the water's surface, rescuers scrambled onto the exposed hull, desperately cutting holes through the thick steel with blowtorches in a frantic bid to reach the screaming victims trapped below. It was a gruesome, slow, and devastating process. Nearby, the USS Wilmette arrived to assist, but the tragedy had already reached its conclusion in the blink of an eye. The city of Chicago watched in absolute horror as bodies began to surface, men, women, and children, dressed in their Sunday best, now lifeless in the polluted river water. The aftermath revealed a culture of willful blindness that permeated the entire maritime industry at the time. Owners had prioritized speed and maximized passenger capacity over the fundamental, immutable laws of physics. Maritime authorities, bound by bureaucratic inertia, had allowed a vessel known to be unstable to carry massive crowds of people without adequate oversight. There was no masked villain here. There were only men in suits who chose to ignore the clear warning signs for the sake of the next ticket sale. As we examine the Eastland, we are forced to confront what we might call the human-made ghost. The same systemic failures overloading to maximize profit, modifying vessels without rigorous engineering oversight, and maintaining a crew ill-trained to handle sudden stability shifts would appear again and again throughout the 20th and 21st centuries. The tragedy of the Eastland was not just the 844 lives lost that morning. It was the precedent set for modern maritime disasters. She remains a silent, steel witness to a lesson we have persistently failed to learn. What made these people believe they were safe? And why, despite our advancements, do we continue to ignore the warnings written in steel? Nearly a century after the Chicago disaster, in April 2014, the world watched in harrowing silence as the MV Sewol, a modern vessel equipped with state-of-the-art radar, satellite communication, and advanced navigational aids, succumbed to the exact same lethal convergence of structural incompetence, cargo mismanagement, and a catastrophic collapse of human command that doomed the SS Eastland in 1915. The Sewol was never merely a victim of the sea. She was the inevitable casualty of a corporate and regulatory culture that prioritized profit margins, rapid expansion, and administrative convenience over the fundamental stability of the vessel and the sanctity of the 476 lives entrusted to her care. The MV Sewol was built in Japan as the ferry Naminu, and the vessel served its purpose faithfully for many years before being sold to the South Korean operator Chunghaijin Marine. What followed was a series of renovations that, in the cold light of retrospective analysis, constituted acts of criminal negligence. Much like the Eastland's infamous, ill-fated addition of top-heavy lifeboats, the Sewol was subjected to illegal, unapproved structural modifications. The owners, driven by a desperate desire to increase passenger capacity and cargo volume, welded additional passenger decks onto the ship's superstructure. This audacious act of greed drastically raised the ship's center of gravity. To make matters even worse, in a desperate attempt to offset the weight of these illegal topside additions and meet stability regulations on paper, the company systematically removed critical ballast water, the very fluid that acts as a ship's low-level anchor against the destabilizing forces of wind, current, and tide. The Sewol was effectively transformed into a top-heavy, hollow shell, a vessel stripped of the weight required to remain upright when subjected to even moderate lateral forces. On the morning of the 16th of April 2014, the Sewol embarked on her voyage to Jeju Island, carrying a majority of students from Danwon High School on a quintessential field trip. The cargo holds were not merely filled, they were packed far beyond the vessel's safety ratings. The ship was crammed not only with vehicles, but with hundreds of tons of iron rebar, construction materials, and heavy industrial goods, much of which remained improperly lashed and unfastened. This combination of an elevated center of gravity and shifting, unrestrained internal weight created a lethal, unstable environment. As the ship navigated the turbulent waters of the Mangal Channel, a region notorious for its powerful, unpredictable currents, a routine turn caused the massive, unsecured cargo to shift violently. The shift functioned as a dynamic weight transfer. The ship leaned, and because the ballast was insufficient to counteract the force of gravity pulling on the shifted mass, she could not recover. The Sewol began to list, and in that agonizing, breathless moment, the structural failures of a century past manifested in chilling real-time detail. As the ship began to tilt at an angle of roughly 30 degrees, the failure of the human element, the crew emerged as the primary catalyst for the coming tragedy. Here, we must confront the paralyzing confirmation bias that plagued the bridge and sealed the fates of those below decks. Captain Lee Junseok and his senior officers, faced with the terrifying reality of a capsizing vessel, fell into a psychological trap. Rather than objectively assessing the rapidly evolving conditions, they clung to the outdated, comforting assumption that the ship would naturally right itself, or that remaining in their current state was the safer, more manageable option. They chose to believe in a narrative of survival that was fundamentally disconnected from the physics of a sinking ship. This confirmation bias prevented them from initiating the one action that could have saved hundreds: an immediate emergency evacuation. Instead, over the ship's intercom system, the passengers, primarily teenagers who trusted the authority of the crew, were repeatedly told to stay in their cabins and remain where you are. It was a command that turned their sanctuary into a steel tomb. For nearly 4 hours, the Sewol drifted and took on water, while the command staff displayed a level of cowardice that is fundamentally difficult for the human mind to comprehend. While the students were explicitly told to stay below decks, The captain and several senior crew members prioritized their own survival above all else, eventually abandoning the ship in a rescue boat while the passengers remained trapped in the rapidly filling cabins. The analysis of this disaster reveals a staggering vacuum of leadership. Had the command staff simply ordered the passengers to don their life vests and ascend to the open upper decks in the early stages of the list, the mortality rate would have been drastically lower. The Sewol did not disappear in an instant like the Eastland. She lingered for hours, a floating, agonizing monument to systemic inaction and moral failure. The failures extended far beyond the bridge of the Sewol. The official response from the South Korean government and the Maritime Rescue Services was characterized by paralyzed indecision, administrative confusion, and a total failure to coordinate. Official search and rescue protocols were hampered by bureaucratic gridlock, while the government's initial response, refusing early offers of international assistance and relying on inefficient, slow internal coordination, essentially wasted the most critical window of time during which hundreds of lives could have been snatched from the brink. When the true scale of the disaster finally permeated the public consciousness, the resulting national trauma was profound and lasting. It wasn't just the loss of life, it was the visceral, painful realization that the system had failed the most vulnerable when they needed it most. The official narrative eventually laid blame on the corporate owners, the rogue crew, and the regulators, but the damage to the nation's soul was already done. The contrast between the Sewol's actual situation and the potential for a radically different outcome is what makes this disaster so excruciatingly painful to analyze. The vessel was equipped with state-of-the-art navigation systems, communication equipment, and a massive supply of life rafts that remained largely unused because the passengers were never given the signal to access them. The tragedy was a cold, calculated consequence of the commodification of human safety. The owners of Cheonggaejin Marine, in their relentless quest to maximize the profit of every square inch of the vessel, had essentially hollowed out the ship's ability to survive. When we look at the internal logistics of the Sewol that morning, we see the exact same corporate mentality that defined the Eastland's final days. A stubborn, delusional belief that safety margins are mere suggestions rather than physical laws, and that human lives are simply another variable in a cold financial equation. Furthermore, the psychological profile of the Sewol crew offers a sobering, essential lesson for all maritime professionals worldwide. The confirmation bias that paralyzed the captain is a recurring, lethal danger in high-stakes environments where long-standing experience is mistaken for absolute, infallible knowledge. When the ship began to lean, the crew looked at the unfolding problem through the fractured lens of their previous uneventful voyages. They lacked the mental agility and the ethical courage to pivot when the circumstances demanded a radical, immediate change in strategy. In 2014, in the age of global connectivity and advanced maritime engineering, a vessel sank because people were told to stay in the very rooms that were rapidly becoming their tombs. It is a haunting, direct echo of the Eastland, where passengers were trapped by that same sense of duty and obedience to authority. The victims of the Sewol were not just casualties of a shipwreck. They were the casualties of a culture that values order, hierarchy, and authority over individual survival and transparent, honest crisis management. In the final assessment, the tragedy of the MV Sewol is an urgent call to action for the entire global maritime community. If we truly want to honor the memories of those lost in the Mangold Channel, we cannot settle for superficial, check-the-box regulatory changes. We must address the deeper, structural issues, the corporate culture that incentivizes shortcuts, the lack of transparency in ship modifications, and the persistent, dangerous reliance on experience without the critical thinking necessary to address novel, sudden threats. As we look at the Sewol, we must ask ourselves, how many more ships must tilt before we realize that the greatest hazard to a vessel isn't the water on the outside, but the negligence hidden on the inside. We are left with the heartbreaking realization that the tools for salvation were at their fingertips, but the system had rendered them completely unreachable. The story of the Sewol is a tragic, modern, and necessary reminder that when we allow greed, arrogance, and blind obedience to captain our vessels, we are inviting the very disasters we claim to be protecting against. The water has a long memory, and it will continue to claim its due as long as we allow the ghosts of the Eastland to dictate the logic of our modern age. It is a debt that we must pay through vigilance, honesty, and an unwavering commitment to the truth, lest we find ourselves writing the next chapter of this century-long preventable saga. While the sinkings of the SS Eastland and the MV Sewol stand as harrowing indictments of corporate greed and human negligence, the tragedies on Lake Superior represent a different, more primal terror. Unlike accidents born of incompetence or structural flaws, the losses in the Great Lakes reveal a violent collision between fragile steel and a meteorological force that defies conventional maritime logic. To understand why massive freighters like the SS Edmund Fitzgerald vanish into the abyss without a trace, we must stop viewing the lake as a mere body of water and recognize it for what it truly is: a predator. The Great Lakes function as a high-pressure laboratory for extreme weather. Unlike the deep, expansive basins of the world's oceans, where swells have thousands of miles to organize into rhythmic, predictable patterns, the Great Lakes are constrained by shallow, enclosed basins. This physical limitation creates short-period, high-amplitude waves. Because the fetch-the-distance wind can blow uninterrupted is limited, the waves generated here are steeper, closer together, and far more violent than Atlantic swells. For a 700-foot-long laker, the physics are nightmarish. When a ship spans 2 or 3 of these steep wave crests, it transforms into a rigid bridge. Its bow and stern are supported by the crests, while the midship hangs, suspended in a trough. This induces massive, cyclical hogging and sagging stresses, causing relentless metal fatigue. To grasp this lethal environment, one must analyze the White Hurricane and the mechanism of a seiche. A seiche is a violent standing wave oscillation caused when sustained winds push surface water to one side of the basin. When the wind subsides, that immense volume sloshes back, shifting water levels by several feet in hours. During a White Hurricane, where a low-pressure system intensifies with the kinetic force of a tropical cyclone, the atmospheric pressure drops so precipitously that the lake seems to inhale, visibility drops to absolute zero, and wind speeds reach hurricane force. The surface becomes a frothing turmoil, where the distinction between water and air vanishes, leaving the ship a blind, battered target. Consider the graveyard of the Great Lakes, specifically the passage between Whitefish Point and Central Lake Superior. In November 1975, the SS Edmund Fitzgerald encountered a perfect storm of disaster. Using 3D mapping to simulate its trajectory, the tactical errors become agonizingly clear. By staying near the northern shore to shield the vessel from the wind, the Fitzgerald inadvertently navigated into a region of highest wave resonance. The lake's geometry, combined with extreme cyclonic winds, created a state of harmonic motion. The ship was subjected to a high-frequency pounding that synchronized with its natural vibration, essentially shaking it to pieces. The volatility here is stark. On a calm July day, the lake is a mirror, breathtaking and inviting. Yet, beneath that surface lie jagged ridges and troughs that have claimed thousands of vessels since the 19th century. On that fateful November night, the barometer plummeted to record lows. Winds peaked at over 85 miles per hour, generating walls of water 30 feet high that slammed into the Fitzgerald with the force of a collapsing building. The energy released in such a confined space is mathematically superior to that of an open ocean storm, as the water has nowhere to dissipate its kinetic energy. It bounces off the lake floor and shores, creating a complex pattern of clopotous waves that can tear a ship apart in seconds. We must also scrutinize the decision-making during these final moments. Was the captain a victim of confirmation bias, similar to the bridge crew of the Sewol? The radio logs reveal a man who was experienced, calm, and seemingly in control, relying on rules of the lake that had kept him safe for decades. But the lake had evolved into a phenomenon that defied his experience, a lethal combination of wave refraction and pressure-induced displacement that no ship was designed to withstand. This is the tragic intersection of human behavior and environmental extremity, the fallible belief that the past is a perfect predictor of the future. The death lane is not merely a geographical location. It is a psychological boundary. Mariners weigh the structural integrity of their hulls against the chaotic fluid dynamics of a basin that can change its mood in minutes. By analyzing the Fitzgerald, which likely suffered a catastrophic failure of its hatch covers, followed by a massive, instantaneous collapse, we see how nature ruthlessly exploits the smallest design weaknesses. A single, improperly secured latch, or a deviation of a few degrees in course, becomes the threshold between survival and a legacy at the bottom. We are left with a sobering realization. The Great Lakes do not care about the ambitions of shipping lines or the pride of a captain. They are a law unto themselves. We study the Eastland and Sewol to understand human fallibility, but we study the Great Lakes to understand the limits of our hubris. The water here is an active participant in the drama of our failures. It waits for the moment of our complacency, and when it strikes, it does so with a mathematical precision that makes our engineering look like child's play. As we move forward, we must ask, what happens when we stop fighting the lake and start respecting its lethal rules? Is it possible to navigate this arena safely, or are we destined to repeat the same errors, writing our history in the iron of sunken hulls and the tears of those left on the shore? The lake is vast, the secrets are deep, and the lessons remain, as cold and unforgiving as the water itself. We must listen to the lake, or we will eventually become part of the silence we fear. Reflecting on the rusted remains of the SS Eastland, the tragic echoes of the MV Sewol, and the unforgiving depths of Lake Superior, a haunting pattern emerges. These are not isolated accidents. They are systemic indictments of human conscience. The Eastland and Sewol were crippled by the same foundational arrogance, the illegal, reckless modification of vessel architecture to prioritize marginal profits over stability. In both cases, the immutable laws of physics were traded for greed. This disregard for safety was never a mere lapse in judgment. It was willful blindness, an institutional culture where human lives became disposable variables in a cold corporate equation. The burden of responsibility rests squarely on corporate executives who viewed their ships not as vessels of human life, but as depreciating assets. By prioritizing profit over naval architecture, they engineered their own disasters. Yet, we must also hold the regulatory bodies accountable. Whether it was the negligence in 1915 Chicago or the administrative malaise before the Sewol's departure, a lethal regulatory lethargy allowed dangerously unstable ships to carry thousands. These regulators were silent, complicit partners. When the self-appointed watchmen turn a blind eye, the architecture of safety crumbles. History teaches us that tragedy is the bitter medicine of progress. Every sunken hull serves as a grim foundation upon which safer standards are built. The Eastland disaster catalyzed the evolution of the International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea, SOLAS, and forced a global respect for load line regulations. Similarly, the Sewol disaster shocked South Korean maritime policy into an overhaul of cargo and structural oversight. By 2026, we operate in an era of unprecedented capability. Automated stabilization systems, real-time hull stress sensors, and AI-driven navigation that can forecast meteorological shifts long before a captain perceives danger. Are we finally safe? If we rebuilt the Eastland or Sewol today with 2026 grade technology incorporating digital twins and autonomous ballast management, they would not sink. Modern engineering would flag structural instability long before the vessels left the dock. However, this brings us to an uncomfortable conclusion. Technology is a tool, not a cure for human fallibility. A ship is only as safe as the moral courage of those who command it. We can automate protocols and install thousands of sensors, but we cannot automate the ethical integrity required to make life or death decisions when the storm mounts. We must confront the failure of command, in both cases, a collapse of the duty to protect. The tragedy was not just that the ship sank, it was that leaders failed to utilize the mechanisms of salvation at their disposal. They were paralyzed by an arrogant belief in their own experience, trapped by confirmation bias, the belief that the status quo would hold even as the water rose. This raises a pressing question. Are we still prone to these primitive traps? Does our digital age offer a false sense of security, leading us to believe that sophisticated systems compensate for a lack of moral compass? The legacy of these disasters is about the ghosts of the past that steer our vessels whenever we allow profit or tradition to supersede human safety. When the next storm hits, be it on Lake Superior or in a turbulent channel, the decision that matters most will not be made by the machine, but by the human at the helm. It is the decision to value the absolute truth of physics over the convenience of a narrative, and to possess the courage to say no when conditions turn lethal. I leave you with this to ponder. We have built safer ships and tighter laws, but have we evolved as leaders? Have we stripped away the corporate greed that made these vessels death traps? Or have we simply hidden it behind bureaucratic walls? If you were the captain, with the wisdom of history in your hands, would you have the courage to defy the pressure to perform, to ignore the order, and to make the unpopular choice to stop and save those who trust you? The water holds its secrets, but it also reflects our own history. We write our past in the iron of sunken hulls and the broken promises of those who walked away while others drowned. But we write our future in the choices we make today. Let us choose a future where we treat the safety of every human life, not as a financial variable, but as a non-negotiable value. History is a cycle, but it does not have to be a trap. Have we finally learned? Or are we just waiting for the next catastrophe to remind us of our place? The reflection is ours to make, and the time for change is always the moment before the water begins to rise. Finally, before we conclude, thank you for walking this somber path with me. If this story resonated with you, please like, share, and subscribe to join our crew for future investigations. What are your reflections on the tragedy we explored today? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your voice keeps these memories alive. Thank you for watching, and I look forward to seeing you in our next deep dive.